very careful about who I work with, and we almost always have a great time. We solve a scene or two every day when we film, and it's a creative and collective voyage we go on, with the camera, with the design, obviously with the writing, with the directing. You know, we all work together to solve this mystery of telling stories.
And it's a
movie guy, and he's very bright and extremely verbal. Although on the set, we wouldn't talk at all, really. When we started shooting, we'd shoot, and I said, Paul, you want to do anything else? You want to try anything? And he said, no, that's good. Let's move on. So that was about it. Best directors don't say anything anyhow. You know, Robert Altman, we made a film together, Dr. T and the Women. Yeah, I came to the set from another job I was doing, and I was watching him shoot a scene with kids, and they were just terrific. And afterwards I said, Bob, how'd you do that? These kids are incredible. And he said, Richard, it's real.
In the new novel, Lily Tuck imagines her life and those of other Polish citizens killed at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Some Catholic, like Czeslawa, and many, many Jews. Her novel?
And decided that I would try and write about her.
And what could you find out? What could be known versus what you had to imagine for a novel?
I found out very little about her. I had a book that was published by the Holocaust Library in Auschwitz that lists all the names of the people who ended up in Auschwitz from her area in Poland. So I knew the date of her birth and her death and her mother as well, but I knew very little about her except where she came from. Mostly what I learned was how many Poles died during World War II, and a lot of people mostly know that the Jews were exterminated and died in Poland, but they don't realize how many Poles died as well during the war.
I'm going to ask you to read a section.
Weather patterns in those regions. Futures prices for both types of beans have soared. Robusta this year has doubled in price. Arabica this week passed a 50-year high, and both have lately gone up and down, hovering around record levels, fueled in part by financial speculators. Brands like Nescafe and Folgers have already raised their retail prices in response. Alina Siruk, NPR News.
Stanley is recalling 2.5 million travel mugs because of problems with the lids. The company says those lid threads on the switchback and the trigger action mugs could shrink if exposed to too much heat, and that means those lids could pop off, posing a burn hazard. The company says they've received more than 90 reports of the lids coming off, with 38 people burned, including 11 who required medical treatment. The mugs sold for between $20 and $50 at major retailers, including Amazon, Walmart, and Target. I'm Janine.
For tickets, go to freakonomics.com/live shows. They are selling briskly, I believe is the word, so hustle up. Again, that is freakonomics.com/live shows. One more thing. The episode you're about to hear is what audio people call a two-way, what normal people call the one-on-one conversation. Most Freakonomics radio episodes aren't like this. We typically feature multiple voices, multiple angles, sometimes even multiple stories, but there is a real opportunity to be had by going deep with one person. So for the next few weeks, we are featuring some one-on-one conversations. You will be hearing about the revolution in the GLP-1 weight loss drugs. You'll hear from one of the best magazine editors of this generation. And in today's episode, conversation with a political figure who several times over his career has been in the room where it happened, with Donald Trump, with Joe Biden, and with Vladimir Putin. And one last reminder about our upcoming live shows, plus one.
It's Biden with Secretary Blinken sitting next to him but not speaking. Putin and his foreign minister Lavrov sitting next to him.
The timing was significant.
It's been a rocky spring between the United States and Russia. We expelled some Russian diplomats. They expelled some of my colleagues from Embassy Moscow. Biden called Putin a killer. Navalny's imprisoned.
The 1+1 would be followed by the second meeting.
They have what's called an expanded bilateral meeting. Those of us who were going into the expanded bilateral, there was a break. Secretary Blinken told us what the two leaders had for our relationship with Russia.
And what did Biden and Putin talk about in that second meeting?
The headline is, what did they not talk about? Ukraine. I look back now and I say the way Putin conducted himself, he had decided he was going to invade Ukraine. He was going to take what he thought was his.
As we all know, Putin did invade Ukraine several months after that sit-down. Today, on Freakonomics Radio, a conversation with John J. Sullivan, a lifelong Republican who has served under 5 U.S. presidents, including Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Sullivan happened to be on duty in Moscow as U.S. ambassador during the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. He's just published a book called Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. It reads a bit like a thriller, spies and subterfuge, threats and bluffs, enormously high stakes. The bulk of the book explains, from inside the House, the Russian Federation's decision to escalate its war in Ukraine. It is a train wreck that you can't look away from, and it left John Sullivan thinking that U.S. foreign policy these days is a bit of a mess.
Our politicians aren't leading, Republicans or Democrats.
John Sullivan now splits his time between Washington, D.C. and Connecticut. He grew up in Boston, attended Brown University, and then Columbia Law School, and launched a perfectly respectable, but, if we're being honest, slightly dull career as a corporate lawyer. There were already a lot of lawyers in his family, even a family law firm in Providence. But there was also an uncle, Bill. He was a combat naval officer during World War II, and afterward he joined the Foreign Service.
He was a 3-time ambassador. He served in Saigon during the early part of the Vietnam War, ambassador to the Philippines, and then the last U.S. ambassador to Iran.
This had made an impression on his nephew.
As a young kid, I remember just being hooked on this conception of public service. Don't get me wrong, it's not an easy life. It's hard on family life, but boy, the rewards are fantastic. Serving the United States abroad and standing for the United States and all that we aspire to stand for, and seeing the American flag flying over a mission in a country like Russia, it's really gratifying.
Sullivan has spent the past several decades toggling between corporate law and government service. He worked in the Justice Department under the first President Bush, and in Commerce and Defense under the second Bush. In 2016, he was back in private practice when Trump was elected. I was as surprised as many were, he writes in his book. I was not an active Trump supporter, but I did still believe in Ronald Reagan's famous 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican. Sullivan had voted for Trump with no thought that I would ever be invited to work in his administration, he writes. He adds that his wife, Grace, also a high-powered lawyer who has since died, had not voted for Trump and would not have been supportive if I were going to work for him at the White House. But it wasn't the White House that called. It was the Defense Department. Secretary Jim Mattis wanted Sullivan as his general counsel, and that's where Sullivan was heading, until he got a better offer. Deputy Secretary of State under Rex Tillerson. That job he took, and when Tillerson was fired by tweet after barely a year on the job, Sullivan became acting secretary. He reverted to deputy when Mike Pompeo took over as secretary. Sullivan liked Pompeo, and they worked well together. But that first Trump administration was an exercise in chaos. Nothing like its Republican predecessors, Sullivan writes, undisciplined and unconventional. So, when he learned that the U.S. ambassador to Russia was resigning, Sullivan put himself up for the post. It's hard to emphasize how unusual this was, trading in a high status. What did President Trump think of this move?
He thought Secretary